We're now into week 7 of Poll 2 PPE, Competing Approaches to Political Economy. How do societies and economies interact? And we're looking this week at Keynesian political economy. And I've tried in each week to pick photos that represent the problem to which the economists were attempting to respond, how they conceptualize their own problems. And here we have some photos that depict unemployed men marching in 1929 after the Wall Street crash, and unemployed workers standing outside of soup kitchens. These are kitchens offering cheap meals, well, free meals, free donuts, coffees, and so forth for the unemployed. And this is the context in which Keynes is writing. I always begin this way, but it's useful to remember our framework when approaching the material in this subject. We're using the same framework every week. We first look at the historical problem as conceptualized by the economists who were responding. What were the problems shouldered by the economists? How did they conceptualize their problems? We'll look at how Keynes conceptualize the problem. Then we'll look at the elements of Keynes's response. And finally, we'll consider Stilwell's questions, but we'll apply those to theory itself. Who gains? Who loses? Does it matter? So let's turn immediately then to part 1, the problems that Keynes shouldered, the problems to which Keynes wanted to reply. We'll talk first about the great stock market crash of 1929. And we'll talk then about the Great Depression that occurred over the 10 years after that, during the 1930s. We'll look briefly at how this was deepened by outward migration of farm workers and their families during the ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl crisis, depicted in stories like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. In particular, we'll notice that Keynes's problem was primarily the mass unemployment associated with the Great Depression and associated with this catastrophe, which worsened the effects of the great stock market crash. The reading that you've got for today on Keynes doesn't really mention mass unemployment at all, and nor does it mention what he's most known for in the popular public context, namely the notion of boosting effective demand and trying to show how consumption is also really important in boosting production and in boosting economic growth. But the text that Stilwell and Argyris have asked you to read, and I'm asking you to read it too, deals with a separate issue, which is why the great stock market crash occurred and what it is about investing that makes the stock market so volatile, with effects that then run deep into other parts of the economy. Let's deal with each of these in turn. Here on this slide, I'm dealing with the lead up to the Great Crash, drawing on Dolores Hayden's book, which I've made available online too. I'm also drawing on Heidi Hartman's PhD thesis on capitalism. She's a well-known feminist economist who worked on labour markets in the 1970s. And I'm drawing on her book, her thesis from 1974. I'm also drawing on Julia Ott's work on When Wall Street Met Main Street, the quest for an investor's democracy, which tracks how the stock market and investment in the stock market became gradually more available to the public at large for investment. And I'll also turn to John Kenneth Galbraith's work, The Great Crash in 1929. But before that, let's deal with this lead up to the crash, the boom of the 1920s. So before the Great Crash in the 1920s, we see a period in American material history that's known for being a massive for being an era of massive production, massive economic growth. And we see here a housing boom where new emerging suburbs are being built and constructed in the outlying areas of industrial cities in the Midwest. Last week in the week on feminist economics, I also pointed to this period as associated with a demise of feminist economic thought. This is a time in which housing producers coordinated with government to offer low interest loans on credit, cheap credit, so that working class families from the tenement inner city locations could move to Midwest suburbs and buy their own practical, fully detached houses with their own internal laundries and own internal kitchens. And this was associated with an explicit effort to tame the expectations of women who'd been working in the factories and send them back into their houses to work in domestic household production instead of in factories in market work. So these periods are interlinked, the one that I discussed last week and this one. So we've got a massive housing boom where Midwest suburbs are flourishing. We've got novelists like Sinclair Lewis writing about the transition to these new suburbs in Nobel Prize winning books like Babbitt. And we've got a boom in the production of a whole range of commodities to support this housing industry and its growth. As we discussed in the week on institutionalism, most economic activities happens in cities. So the housing boom would have been informed by the steel industry. It would have also informed a desire for cars to get to and from the outlying suburbs. So as Heidi Hartman notes in her PhD thesis from the 70s, we also see a boom in the production of General Motors, a boom in the production of labour-saving devices in houses, these emerging suburbs, vacuum cleaners, electric and gas-powered appliances, flat irons, a whole range of other commodities for purchase to support the housing boom. Associated with that, we also saw a stock market boom during this period. And Julia Ott identifies how this emerged and developed across the 1920s. How does one finance the expansion of a country? How does one finance the expansion of a country, of a company? Well, it would be either through bank loans or through selling shares in that company. So if a construction company, a housing producer, wanted to produce more housing, one might need to either finance that through the purchaser's mortgage, and the purchaser would need to find credit through the banks, or if one wanted to expand a vacuum cleaner company's production, one might do so through selling shares in one's company. And so here we have a rise not only of General Motors, General Electrics, but also Westinghouse, not just steel, an American production of those goods for construction, but also other companies that are now seeking to publicly trade shares in their companies to permit further funds to grow their business. And this is something that occurred for the first time in the 1920s. And it really gathered pace and was a particularly Northern American development. It didn't really happen elsewhere around the world until later in the 20th century. We see a rise in speculation where people are investing in stocks, primarily too, no longer just to fund their own companies, but also for the first time to resell them at higher prices. This is a time in which profit is not necessarily related to any growth in productivity anymore. This is where the stock market and speculation really come into its own. Now, I've provided you with an introduction to the stock market that I thought was rather intuitively and well presented. It's a YouTube video where we see a young girl, Jill, who's got a lemonade company, and she's trying to expand her business by selling shares in her company. And that's really at the heart of the stock market. She wants to sell those shares because that will grant her extra cash to then expand. So Jill's wanting to sell shares in her business so that she can get money to expand that business. And people are interested in buying those shares because they think either that when her business expands, they're going to get a share of the profits, the dividends, or because they know that as the company expands, as the business expands, their shares are going to be worth more and they'll be able to sell them at a higher price than the rate at which they bought those shares. So those shares, this is the idea of speculation. One is buying shares no longer for the profit that will accrue on account of the increased productivity and expansion of the business, but really to be able to on-sell. This is what we call speculation. So those shares become greater in value as Jill's business expands and become more profitable. And this is what we need to grasp in order to understand the great crash of 1929. Galbraith talks about this rise of speculation during this period, land speculation in Florida, which collapsed pretty dramatically around this period. So what we're seeing is speculation in the stock market, people investing in stocks primarily to resell them at higher prices. And we see really that profit is no longer necessarily related to any growth in productivity at all. Really, it's just that the stocks themselves have increased in productivity. The value of the stock might actually improve without any growth in productivity at all. That is also possible, based merely on the desire for that share by other people through hype or marketing or whatever. And so we see a rise in speculation during this period too, where speculation is just simply people buying and selling shares to then on-sell them and earn profit. Now, let's imagine what happens if the shares in Jill's lemonade business drop in price. And this is what this slide is about. These are shares that she's offering for sale in order to finance her business's expansion. So what will happen if they drop? If the price of shares drop? Well, her company will no longer be able to fund its expansion. And if, for example, it was midway through an expansion process, say constructing an extra cart to sell the lemonade on, that expansion may need to cease mid-project. And this might put the people she's employed out of work. It may reduce their income. It also prevents there from being as much lemonade available for purchase on the market. And the people who are out of work are not able to consume lemonade anymore. And so consumption drops too. And when consumption drops, when demand drops, we know from neoclassical economics that when the supply or production of lemonade, when demand drops, when consumption drops, when buyers are no longer seeking to buy so much lemonade, then there's less incentive for producers to be producing and supplying because the price is lower. And this is what happened during the Great Depression. We saw a whole range of indices dropping, production dropping off, consumption dropping off, problems with the housing market, foreclosures and the like. All because of speculation and its effects on the real economy. So what happened exactly? Well, the shares of the major public trading companies plummeted. Here I'm drawing on Galbraith's classic text in this area from 1955, appropriately entitled The Great Crash 1929. Galbraith is a very well-known economist that also has a historical eye, so he's interesting in that regard. So on September the 5th, 1929, after a strong trading day prior, the price of stocks suddenly plummeted. General Motors, General Electric, Westinghouse Steel, American Tel & Tel, all of these major publicly trading companies who were selling shares to finance further expansion plummeted. Their shares plummeted in their price. Now, Galbraith points out that, and this will tie into Keynes's account of uncertainty, the uncertainty that plagues the decision of investors who have to predict into the future in a world of uncertainty. Galbraith points out that the immediate cause of this crash was interesting. Galbraith tells us that Roger Babson, a leading businessman and stock market seer, had spoken the day prior to the crash at the annual National Business Conference. And he actually predicted the crash. He predicted that a crash would occur. So let me So what he said, he stated quite provocatively that sooner or later a crash is coming, and it may be terrific in its size. And he said factories will be shut down, men will be thrown out of work, the vicious circle will get into full swing, and the result will be a serious business depression. So Wall Street immediately denounced him for the effect that this prediction had on the confidence of the investors. Because what happened the next day? The price of stocks plummeted. And why did they plummet? Because the investors wanted to get rid of them. They were worried that they would be left with stock that was no longer increasing in its value but declining in its value. And they wanted to be selling at as high a price as possible. And that meant that there was a rush to sell. And with the rush to sell came fear. And people started to accept lower prices in selling. And the prices of the stock went down. The very day after this influential prediction, this prediction that brought into effect what it predicted by affecting the confidence of the investors. And so Wall Street immediately denounced Babson. But over the next several months after that initial crash, uneven investment characterised the stock market, with other interrelated events also affecting confidence. There was the discovery of fraudulent behaviour in the London investment markets. There were opinion pieces reflecting on how people stay too long in a rising market and then lose the majority of their wins. And this affected the confidence of the investors who were speculating, right? So by the autumn of 1929, the economy was well into depression. There are many more elements of this fascinating history to be found in Galbraith's classic text. If it's not available online through the library, I'll try and make a copy as an EPUB book until it comes in. Although it might be in now. We'll see. But you get the picture. A number of elements were coinciding here to produce a crash. So the effects were that industrial and factory production experienced a downturn in June of the 1930s. So, as an effect of this great crash of 1929, indices of industrial and factory production suffered a severe downturn. Factory payrolls, freight car loadings, department store sales, these all declined too, but at a distance, sometime later on, once the effects on the housing industry and factory production had occurred. Home building, which had already begun to slumped still further, and there was a lot of construction that was simply left unfinished. By 1933, 40 to 50% of all home mortgages in the US were in default, and the financial system was sliding towards complete collapse. Finally, down came the stock market completely. Production, prices, incomes, and all other indicators would continue to shrink through 3 long and dismal years. Galbraith tracks unemployment rates, showing how they rose dramatically during this period. He also investigates the popular claim that suicide rates rose, and he tracks that statistically as well, providing evidence to support it, particularly during the Great Depression stage, and less so after the initial Great Crash. In 1933, gross national product, the total production in an economy, this was nearly a third less than it had been in 1929. So 33% less production was going on. It wasn't until 1937 that production actually recovered to its 1929 levels. And in 1933, nearly 13 million people were out of work, about 1 in every 4 of the labour force, 25%. 25%. Even in 1938, 1 person in every 5, 20%, were still out of work. So it really did have a massive effect on unemployment. Between 1930 and 1940, only once in 1937 did the average number of unemployed drop. The drop for that year being to below 8 million. Unemployment was also worsened by the Dust Bowl crisis, which hit across the 1930s, affecting the American and Canadian prairies in what's called the Midwest. So this was due to unsustainable farming practices and drought, and it led to massive waves of migration of farming families from affected areas into the towns on the coasts. This story's been told often in popular culture, for example, in John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, and a whole host of other writings. Woody Guthrie, Dorothy Lang's photography of this period has depicted the conditions of migrants, particularly strikingly. We see here this really increasing unemployment in towns, on the outskirts of towns, in camps, migrant camps and so forth. Now, as I said earlier, in Stilwell and Argus's reader, they've selected a text by Keynes that doesn't really present his major contribution, the notion of aggregate demand, effective aggregate demand, and how to increase that in an economy. But what the text by Keynes does do, that you're asked to read today, is map out why, theoretically, the Great Crash occurred. So the value of the text they provided is to really show Keynes's views on the impact of speculation on the real economy, on how this creates the likelihood of unemployment, cycles of unemployment, as a condition to then understanding his solution, which the text doesn't go into, but we will in the lecture. So the value of their text that they've selected by Keynes is to show you why the Great Crash occurred. So I see that text as more about an explanation of investment decisions and their fraught nature than really what Keynes is known for primarily, his policies that responded to the Great Depression that followed on from the Great Crash. So in the text you're asked to read today, he's really exploring how investors invest, how best to invest, why investors don't always invest in the right ways, and why crises in investment markets occur with effects on the real economy. And Keynes argues that investment decisions are always fraught. They require people to form expectations and make predictions about the value of shares across a period of time. But judgments to ground these expectations are very difficult to make, he points out. Investment decisions require judgments about risks and a precise calculation of prospective profits. And this requires both facts, but it also requires confidence in our forecasting and predictions. And both, our ability to do both, can go awry. We already saw how Galbraith noted that a business and stock market seer, well respected in the community of stock market investors, actually undermined confidence in forecasting and actually led to, by virtue of a prediction that then came into effect, led to the initial crash on the 5th of September 1929. So it can be as little as that, a confidence issue. But facts are also important here. The facts are very difficult to identify, to ascertain, Keynes points out. Our knowledge is precarious. We can't tell very well whether shares will go up and down. And Keynes will explain this in terms of what it is that makes investors invest. This inability to have real facts at our disposition can also affect our confidence and make us more liable to the judgments of other people. Why is it then that we become more liable to be affected by the judgments of other people? Well, because when investors invest, they do so, Keynes argues, on a par with what he refers to in this text as a kind of beauty selection, a beauty contest selection competition. And this was something that was occurring in the newspapers that he would have been reading at the time. Keynes mentions it in the article that you've been asked to read this week. This competition, it's also mentioned in that introduction to the stock market that I asked you to have a look at, that video. It's a really good resource, that Netflix introduction to the stock market, because it has Keynes interwoven into it, I think. So there's a competition in the newspaper, and this was happening during Keynes's time, where you had to rank in order of beauty a series of faces from 1 to 6. You had to pick out the 6 most beautiful faces according to you and rank them. And the newspaper would then collate all of the responses. And you would win a prize if your selections corresponded with the overall view of the readership who had answered. So let me turn to the next page. So that's rather odd, right? In the end, you're not really trying to rank those faces that you genuinely believe are the most beautiful. You're actually trying to rank what you think others view or are likely to view as the most beautiful, and that might be different. For Keynes, this shows something specific to investment decisions. It's about anticipating what others are going to do, and it doesn't really have that much to do with any objective external value of the share itself in terms of the health of a company in which you're investing. It has more to do with our judgments about what others are going to do As he puts it, we've reached the third degree where we devote our intelligences to anticipating what average opinion expects the average opinion to be. And there are some, he continues, who practice even the fourth and the fifth and higher degrees. So our judgments are really based on an anticipation of what others are going to do, how others make their value judgments. And in turn, others are deciding on value by anticipating how still more others are going to be valuing. And it ends up having very little relationship sometimes to the health of a company, the likelihood that that company will be able to be productive and so forth. And that's really interesting because it makes investment and investment decisions doubly problematic. Not only do we not have the facts at our disposition to assist us to make those decisions about shares and investing in them, we're also really relying on what other people think are healthy shares. And that leads us to be more liable to manipulation by marketing, by hype and other factors. In fact, Keynes dismisses an alternative, and it's an alternative that's discussed in the explainer on the stock market. Surely, Keynes asks, there are those who don't proceed like this, surely there are people who actually purchase their investments based on a careful study of the books, looking at the health of the company, what they own, how they're managed, whether they've made good decisions in the past, what their profitability has been so far, what their production levels have been like over the past few years, and their own prospects for growth. Now, the explainer for the stock market, that little video that I provided you with, refers to Warren Buffett as one such investor. An investor that's presented in that video as a rigorous and thorough, looking at revenue sheets, balance books, and basing an investment decision on those judgments and less on the judgments of other people. And that might potentially make such an investor, and one like Warren Buffett, less susceptible to the sort of hype that might have led to the bust of the dot-com companies that were discussed in that little video. But Keynes doesn't think this is the norm. He thinks it's very rare for this to happen, and it's not the way people tend to decide. He doesn't think that we base our decisions on genuine long-term expectations based on a factual perusal of the health of companies. He thinks we rather decide based on how other people think, how we think other people think, and what other people are going to do, our expectations around that. And this leads to vulnerability in the stock market, the susceptibility of stock market decisions to crises of confidence, and the ability of a stock market seer like the one that spoke prior to the 1929 crash to have a massive effect on the confidence of investors. So the problem in sum is then how to secure the conditions for stable investment, how to alleviate the society-wide problems that the variability of investment can give rise to, like the Great Depression, how to respond to mass unemployment as one of those society-wide problems, how to get production happening again, how to improve standards of living through consumption by the poorer classes. These are Keynes's problems. And they're still very much problems of our own times. Can we find some ideas in Keynes for today's world? Let's turn now to Keynes's solution. This is part 2, the response to the problem. Before we turn to an account of how Keynes's approach to these problems differed with the dominant neoclassical approach of his times, I'd like to ask you to have a look at this YouTube link which will introduce you to the two very different ways in which two successive governments in the US approached the task of assisting to get over the Great Depression. On the one hand, you have the Hoover administration, and on the other hand, you have Franklin Roosevelt's approach. And what Hoover did, as you'll see in this video, was to announce significant cuts in taxes for individuals and corporations. Hoover had also been a proponent of the government working with housing producers earlier on in the 20s to support low interest loans so that families could purchase houses, moving from tenement accommodation to the Midwest suburbs. Here, during a period of depression, Hoover advocated for significant tax cuts to both individuals and corporations. He also advocated for soup kitchens and free coffee spots, like the photo depicted on the first slide, with people lining up for food outside of public kitchens provided by government. And that was basically it. He also targeted, as I said, housing, but the policies are generally agreed to have been ineffective for a variety of reasons. So they didn't lead to any continuation of construction or a boost in the confidence in consumption or income. So there was real dissatisfaction at Hoover's response. Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, for a while embraced Keynesian economics and felt that the government should be spending money, even if it meant going into deficits, in order to invest in trying to prop up demand, to prop up consumption. So the state became more present in people's lives. And this video that I've directed you to shows that there were three stages of this. There was a relief, a recovery, and a reform, with the relief stage wanting to provide immediate relief. So this stage involved a civilian conservation cause, with young people being paid to build national parks. This is like the Tree Corps that Roosevelt really advocated for. Agricultural Adjustment Act, other relief-oriented initiatives, public works, to build bridges, schools, airports, dams to provide cheap electric power and so forth. The next stage involved recovery, including the National Labour Relations Act, which permitted a right to unionise around unfair practices, including an explicit refusal to allow people to be paid less than a living wage so that people could actually buy the cheapest products. There's a lovely quote by Eleanor Roosevelt in the video that I've linked you to here. All of these recovery initiatives were oriented around the idea that the economic downturn was caused by underconsumption. So productivity and production was driven, it was recognised by consumption. So if consumption reduced, then this would have an impact upon production. So a focus on underconsumption and an effort to try and boost consumption was viewed as the best way to provide economic security so that workers could spend, which would then lead to production. So it's a different way of seeing the relationship between production and consumption, where neoclassical economists had traditionally viewed production as generating its own supply. Supply produces its own demand, says a famous economist called Say. Whereas Keynes disputes that and says, no, supply doesn't create its own demand. It's not that products are produced and then they find consumers based on the price, the market clearing price. No, it's rather that consumption drives production. And if we don't have effective demand, then we're not going to have production and economic growth. So it's switching things on their head, turning them around, reversing the order of hierarchy and priority. And that's what you get from the link to this video that I've asked you to have a look at. You can see how this worked in practice during this period of depression. So Keynes's general solution, which is presented at the end of your required reading, even though Keynes's account really focuses on the investor and the investor's decisions, he does say quite clearly at the end that it's necessary for government to play some role in directly organising investment and also in boosting demand for the things that are produced. And that's what we're going to look at now, how Keynes's approach constitutes a critique of the neoclassical approach, leading to very different policy outcomes. So there are 4 key neoclassical tenets that Keynes rejects. And they're a little bit complicated, so it's worth teasing them out as best we can. So neoclassical economists thought that if a market is competitive, if there's no monopolies and no trade unions, if there's no monopolies or trade unions preventing prices from working as they should, then a market will itself spontaneously permit full employment. A neoclassical economist thinks that everyone who wants a job should be able to find one in perfectly competitive markets with no monopolies and no trade unions. And this means that governments should not intervene in markets. Why did neoclassical economists think this at the time that Keynes was writing? Well, they felt that price would adjust to permit everyone to be employed as a function of the employer's willingness to pay. This would mean that some workers would receive less wages than others, depending on how much an employer was willing to pay, and how many workers were looking for work, supply, demand, meeting to create an equilibrium price, a market clearing price with supply matches demand. The supply of workers will then match the demand for workers by employers, and there will be spontaneous resolution of unemployment, with everyone being able to find a job if they so want. So as I've said, the implication is that governments shouldn't intervene in markets, in employment markets, in labour markets, if the idea is that price can manage the supply and demand of labour by itself. But Keynes disagrees. Keynes thinks that what we saw quite clearly in the Great Depression was that an unregulated market will not spontaneously lead to full employment. He doesn't really offer any real argument in favour of that view. That might reveal a lack of knowledge on my part because I'm not an expert on Keynes, but I couldn't find an argument like that in the texts that I've read so far. He just seems to assume that because it's so obvious that full employment doesn't exist, that an unregulated market won't lead to full employment. Perhaps it's obvious to Keynes that perfect competition doesn't exist, and so one needs trade unions in a context where monopolies exist, which then again means that markets being non-competitive will not operate in the way that the neoclassical economists had expected them to, theoretically. So the main point is that Keynes thinks that an unregulated market will not spontaneously lead to full employment. So there's a further tenet of the early neoclassical approaches to money that Keynes rejected. Neoclassical economists theorised that all money would either be spent or invested. Invested also meant investing in a deposit in a bank for interest rates, savings, because that's a type of investment rather than doing nothing with it. So if one doesn't immediately spend one's income on goods that one might like to have, that would mean for a neoclassical economist that you're more interested in the interest rates that you can achieve through not consuming. So you don't spend that money and you put it in the bank to get a higher rate of interest, saving it to get interest. And according to the neoclassical view, a higher rate of interest will induce households to supply more of their money to savings, putting their money in deposit accounts in banks. And this can then be used by banks to invest. And a lower interest, on the other hand, will induce households to save less and to spend more. So the early neoclassical approach was about inducing household behaviour through interest rates. Now, Keynes thinks that changes in the rate of interest do not really have much impact upon whether people save or consume. He thinks that people save or consume as a function of their income level. People with higher incomes tended to save a higher portion of it, whereas poorer people tended to save very little and to spend most of their income on the things that they needed. So he's going to conclude from this that if you want to boost production through consumption, we're really going to be wanting poor people to be able to be consuming those products, which means that we want to ensure that poor people have employment in order to spend and consume, because they're the ones that are going to be spending and consuming the most of their income. He also thinks that if the government lowers the interest rates on its bond sales, and I'll tell you what bonds are in a moment, if they do that instead of modifying rates of interest, then the government can reduce the cost of borrowing through the financial markets and not rely just on deposits for loans. So a government bond is an instrument that allows you to show that the government has accepted you purchasing that instrument from them. I'll say that again. So a government bond is an agreement with the government, an instrument of indebtedness where you purchase this agreement from the government. You give the government your money in return for a commitment that the government will provide a fixed rate of interest for your purchase of it within a specified time. So I might buy $100 of government bonds and the government will say, well, after 2 years, well, after a year, let's say, you will get a 5% interest. You'll get $105 back. And then that's a way that the government can finance its own spending, producing more money for it to be able to then use in spending. So if the government lowered interest on its bond sales rather than modifying rates of interest, then the government could reduce the cost of borrowing throughout the financial markets, not relying on deposits for loans. There's a third tenet of neoclassical thinking that Keynes rejected. Neoclassicals, these early neoclassicals, upheld the quantity theory of money, which said that printing more money will lead to changes in price level only. It will lead to inflation. Prices will go up. Printing more money won't have any effect on boosting production. It will actually only contribute to inflation. Imagine that there's a certain amount of money in the economy and the government prints more money and distributes that to people. Now, what's going to happen according to the neoclassical theory that Keynes was responding to is not that people are going to buy more goods. Rather, because everyone's got more money, they're going to buy the same amount of goods, but the price is going to go up because there's more money. And people are going to be more able and willing to pay more for what they were already going to be purchasing. So it's not going to have any effect on boosting production. But Keynes begs to differ. He disagrees. He thinks that the quantity theory of money is wrong. He thinks that printing money can have an effect on boosting production, particularly if it's distributed in ways that then gets into the pockets of the least well off. Because we know from the previous slide that the least well off are more likely to be spending their money than investing their money. And that's going to boost production because it's going to provide a market for what is made and clear the market in that way. So he thinks that an individual can still be rational and hold money rather than spend it. And this can work against inflation. And also that the use of bond sales can assist in holding prices steady and prevent inflation. This applies to those who are well off and who don't have an immediate need to consume. They will take the opportunity to invest in government bonds for a 5% return at the end of the year, let's say, whereas the working and poorer classes will immediately spend the money and consume goods, thereby assisting to find a market for production and to boost production. The fourth criticism is that neoclassical economists think that supply creates its own demand spontaneously. And as I've said before, early neoclassical thinking is that what is produced will always find someone to produce it as long as the price is right. So markets will always clear. And that's equivalent to the view that economic growth is really only limited by what's called the supply side, the availability of resources with which to expand production and to supply goods to a market. Now, if we recall classical political economy in week 1 of our class, David Ricardo thought that land was limited and that production would be limited by the supply of land. Now, Keynes would disagree with that. He thinks not only are there products that simply won't clear, but also people might want to invest rather than spend. They might save and have deposits rather than spend. And this will prevent production. It'll prevent goods from being cleared in a market. So really, what Keynes is interested in doing is trying to work out how to promote boosts in consumption to get people to get the least well off to be spending more, and to have the well off to be putting their money into savings. Again, consumption is the key thing here. So it's not that supply creates its own demand spontaneously, but rather that the willingness and ability of people to actually pay to consume things drives production. So if people can't even afford to pay, if they can't afford then to consume, then production is going to reduce. And that's not because of any limited resources to expand. So this is where you see Keynes coming in and saying, well, we need to boost demand. We need to boost consumption in various ways, and that will drive production. And we need to also provide avenues for savings for the well-off. So that will both drive economic growth and will also prevent inflation. So the major policy implication, and this is from the Arguer's text, is that the economy won't reach full employment on its own, but that the government can actually assist by stepping into increased demand. Employment is the key to consumption, because when people are earning an income, they are then able to consume. And it's consumption that drives production and economic growth, not the inverse. It's not production that drives consumption. Now, recalling the global financial crisis of 2008, I know it's before your time, you would have been young, most of you. It's interesting to remember that Joseph Stiglitz complimented Wayne Swan at that time, the treasurer for the Labour government, because Swan had employed Keynesian techniques in assisting Australia to be one of the only countries around the world to avert an economic recession during that time. And the government at the time employed techniques that were intended to boost employment when unemployment threatened and loomed. And in so doing, employment was boosted, consumption was boosted through the income that people were able to maintain through a period of uncertainty and investment uncertainty. The state was able to provide certainty in a context of the sorts of crises of confidence that Keynes spoke of in the text that you read. So how was this done? Well, the state can intervene in the following ways. The first would be to increase the supply of money. Because, as we know, Keynes rejects the quantity theory of money. Speculators won't have to push up the interest rate in order to get hold of cash being held by households. Unlike the quantity theory, changes in the amount of money can actually have permanent effects on the actual quantity of real output. And they don't need to cause inflation if controlled for by other means through savings and government bonds and so forth. The neoclassical economists were wrong, Keynes claimed. States can also manage interest rates. We'll see that Keynes's idea of using bond sales to prevent inflation when this happens has been absorbed into what's now called the neoclassical synthesis, where Keynesian ideas have combined with neoclassical approaches in what's called the synthesis. By lowering interest rates through bond sales, the government can lower the cost of borrowing throughout the financial markets. So that idea has become mainstream now thanks to the impact of Keynes on mainstream neoclassical economics. Third, the state can increase public investment. If the private sector is unwilling to undertake long-term investments, government can make its own investments in roads, ports, schools, etc. These will finance themselves as the increase in income that results from the multiplier will generate higher tax revenue to the government. And finally, there's the distribution of income according to Keynes. In order to increase society's propensity to consume, we saw that the poor have a higher propensity to consume than the well-off. And the government can then alter the amount of consumption that takes place through these redistributive techniques. Now, last week in the week on feminist economics, I briefly mentioned Eleanor Rathbone's influence on Keynes. Eleanor Rathbone had an economic thinker in the early 20th century, had published an article in the 1920s arguing in favour of family allowances paid per child allowances paid to mums, so that because mums would spend that money immediately on children's needs. And in the 1930s, in 1936 I think it was, this idea was advocated for by Keynes, who provided advice to Treasury that they should bring in child allowances for British mums by redistributing income to those most likely to spend on the consumption of children. This would boost production too. So he supported this, and then British mums were able to receive cash child allowances every Tuesday morning at the post office. And Keynes also predicted, as a basis of the advice to Treasury, that it would be cost neutral within 5 years because of the increased revenue that would come back to the government in the form of taxation on the incomes that would actually exist now, given that economies were operating more productively, employing more people, with production being generated in response to increased consumption increasing employment rates, increasing people on salaries, increasing taxation revenue. So we can see that these are the varied solutions that Keynes wanted governments to use to respond to depression. And you can see how this involved a criticism of popular and prevalent neoclassical approaches at the time, some of which have now been taken up by the mainstream. And these are techniques and initiatives that you will now be accustomed to if you're undertaking economics and studying it further in your course. So it now remains for us to consider Stilwell's questions and apply them to theory itself. And that's what we'll do now. Who benefits, who loses, and does it matter? Well, it seems to me that everyone stands to benefit, both producers, both those with shares that they want to sell on the market, both those who are at risk of unemployment, because overcoming unemployment increases the amount of people that have incomes who are going to spend on consumption. That's going to be good for production. That's going to boost economic growth. And producers are then going to be interested in expanding and using the stock market again to do that. So it seems like everybody benefits from this. As to the question of who loses, there seems to be a focus primarily on those who are less well off due to the propensity of the less well off to consume more because of their needs. In a time of depression, having the least well off benefit more also seems like a normatively good thing to do. So putting my political philosopher hat on as well and thinking about what's right and wrong, we might say that behind a veil of ignorance where we don't know where we're going to find ourselves in society, we might actually be more concerned for the least well off in context of depression. We might want to say that it really does matter that the burdens and benefits of depression and economic growth are shared more equitably, because that's what we would have liked ourselves were we deciding about how states should manage economic inequalities behind a veil of ignorance where we don't know where we're going to find ourselves. For those Pole 1 PPE students, you might recall that we looked briefly at rules in the module on economic inequality in your first year core subject for PPE. So I would say it does matter in this way. Note here, though, that we still have no consideration of the environment. This is still very much a concern with economic productivity, how best to use the resources available, put them to effective use in being able to produce more than an economy previously produced. So that's it for this week. You've looked at the problem that Keynes shouldered. You looked at Keynes's response. And we looked at who benefits, who loses, and whether it matters. Here are the 4 texts that I highly recommend, which I used to outline the problem in more detail. If you eventually choose to do an essay on a related topic, you might find these texts interesting and useful.